So in this video, I'm going to talk about fire and forget async pattern with WSO2 API Manager. So what does this fire and forget means, and how can we accomplish this using WSO2 API Manager is the focus of this particular video. Right, let's imagine you have a client and you have a backend service, and where you bring API Manager in place is to proxy those backend services through an API proxy for a client for various purposes like API authorization, rate limiting, throttling, and to bring all sorts of API governance use cases. That's where an API proxy comes into play. In such a case, a client will make a request. A request will reach the API proxy, and API proxy will forward that to backend only after it manages the API. For example, only after it verifies the token when it comes to security, after also making sure the rate limits policies are all adhered to, only then the API proxy will forward that particular HTTP call to a backend service. It's typical. So the focus of this video is not to talk about API Manager, but how to accomplish fire and forget type of a scenario with API proxy. So when this happens, after some time, backend will respond, and the proxy will respond that response that backend sent to the API proxy back to the client. And in this typical scenario, both the client and the proxy will wait for the backend to respond, right? Client will wait until the API proxy responds, and API proxy will wait until the backend responds. But there can be situations where a client and a backend service exists, and you have an API proxy. The request is sent and the request is forwarded, but backend takes time to process. Such as a scenario where the client sends a large payload to the API proxy, and that has to go to the backend service, and that needs to be processed to maybe aggregate it, maybe fetch certain details. It could take a while, like maybe even in modern context, even few seconds could be quite a bit of latency that clients should not be bearing too much, right? So in such a case, it's best that API proxy doesn't wait for a response. Similarly, a client, right? So in such a case, most of the time clients in a proper async environment, it just sends a request and it forgets about what should be the response and so forth. The response may be available, may not be available. If it's available, it can be sent back to the client in some other form, such as using a webhook or something like that. But in such a scenario, how do we make sure this client API proxy and backend service, where the client sends a request, how do we make sure API proxy immediately respond with a 202, or that status code can be something client specific. Client might want that to be a 200 or 202 and so forth. Typically it's a 202, where client doesn't want API proxy to hold until a response comes. And a client doesn't care whether API proxy what API proxy does and so forth. So typically in such a case, API proxy should also forward that particular request to the backend in an out only mode, meaning even API proxy doesn't want to wait for the backend to respond and so forth. Typically proxy also doesn't wait, and backend takes time to process. And typically when we say backend takes time to process, it could be analyzing the payload and eventually doing something, maybe like putting it into a queue or a database and so forth, right? So how can we accomplish this? In a typical scenario, this can be accomplished from this backend service itself, where the backend service, the client will call the API proxy, the request will be sent, and the API proxy forwards that to the backend, and backend immediately responds with a 202 to the API proxy, and API proxy immediately responds back to 202 with 202 to the client. But we can't always rely on the backend service, because we cannot expect backend service to adhere to this pattern. saying, okay, when you get the request, you have to respond back immediately. And that may not be ideal also, especially because when there is a slow connection and various other reasons can cause that API proxy to the backend call to the API proxy to take some time. Until that time, holding client is not ideal. So it's best if API proxy can respond immediately, without making client wait for the response. And API proxy deals with this backend complexities. Typically, API proxy also shouldn't wait for it. So how can we do this thing in WSO2 API Manager? There is no default way of doing this thing, and that's why I wanted to talk about this. Now, I have an API Manager started, and this is the API Manager URL. If you look at, I'll just and go to the API Manager, you see I have a bunch of APIs already available here. So let me first sign in, and we have multiple APIs. I also have this async fire and forget thing, and also an MCP server and so forth. API Manager, the modern API Manager, WSO2 API Manager supports these MCP servers and AI gateway concepts and so forth. But that scenario is, I'll talk about that in another video later on. But for the time being, I want to talk about this async fire and forget. So how we go about doing this is you had to go and create, and I have a backend for that already. So let me show you that backend as well. So for example, I vibe coded this. So it's a Flask service where you get a request at /ingest, and it finds the time, and it takes the payload, logs the time, and then hand over the payload to in a thread. And in this case, it immediately responds, right? And in the payload, it waits for 3 seconds, and then it logs the payload as well as the time again, and logging process happens in this particular format, right? And that's all it does. It's a very simple service. So let me start that service to showcase. Okay, I'll bring this up. So I have my service here. Let me first go into the virtual environment that I have, right? And I activate it, and then I'm going to start this service. Okay, the service is started. It doesn't log anything. So let me just quickly open. Okay, well, let's do this. I have a curl request. So I'm going to call this curl request. This is the request I'm going to call. You see, I'm getting an HTTP status code. I'm printing that, and then it's calling that ingest context with this header content type application JSON, and then sending a payload. So when I do that, I get an immediate response, because in this case it just stops. But you see, it's received at this time, and the payload is also printed, right? And that took 3 seconds to do that thing. But in a typical environment, it could be more than that. And in this case, I simulated this HTTP 2022 to come back immediately. But in my code, I could have done this process here without doing any response. But let's leave it as that. So this is the backend that I'm going to use. What I'm going to do right now is, in the API Manager, you can go and create a new API, right? For example, you can go and create a new API. I have already done it, so I'm going to go back and show you this. And so I just named it with async fire and forget API, and my context is /fire and forget. And where I can do some basic configurations is So in this case, I haven't done much configuration here. Subscriptions I haven't done because this particular video is not about demonstrating subscription plans and so forth, right? And I can go to the runtime section. Again, HTTPS both are enabled, O2. So these are like standard configurations related to uh, this API, and I have created a new uh, path. So by default you will get all the paths related to post, get, delete, put and so forth. I had to delete all of those and create this new path for /ingest. So it will take the /ingest so that this particular context will be forwarded to the backend, right? And you can look at the API definition and the endpoint. You see this is the endpoint which is of my backend endpoint, and that /ingest resource that I created, when API Manager, API Gateway gets a request to /ingest, it just appends that to the original endpoint which I have here, and it will make the call to the backend. And that's how things work in WSO2 API Manager. So now I have this for both production and sandbox. And in this case, now how typically it works is it will wait for a response. When API Manager calls the backend service, it will wait for the response, right? And I don't want that to happen, and that's what we're going to demonstrate, right? So here in this case, I have the deployment done. It's deployed, this revision is deployed, and if you go to the life cycle, it is also published. Otherwise you have to publish it, right? So that's what you're going to do, and you can go to the developer portal, and when you go to the developer portal, you can sign in again, and you see this particular URL, right? So when this is the API URL, and now I need to call the API Manager with this URL. For this I need a because this is protected using API Manager, I need to have my application subscribe to this particular API. You can go to the application section, and I have an application called Product Flask, and if you go to all the subscriptions, you can add a new subscription here. I have subscribed that application, Product Flask app with Async Fire and Forget API. It's subscribed with unlimited plan because I only had that plan, right? And because of this, if I use the key related to this particular application, that should work. But I have enabled OAuth, if you remember in the runtime section, I have enabled OAuth, so I need OAuth token as well. So I can go here, and in my case I can generate a new access token, and I have the token. For example, I can go and call this, let's try this one, right? I'm just making a call. You get a 404, which means, okay, so you get a 404 because I'm not the backend doesn't exist, right? So I need to put a /ingest there. So let's do that. So go back to /ingest. When I do that, now you are getting HTTP status code 401, right? So this is actually getting returned from my backend, right? So initially it's getting called, as you can see, it's getting called, and now I need to make sure my token is correct. So how do I get the token? I can programmatically get it, but otherwise I can get it from here as well. I don't have any scopes related to this particular API, so I'm going to copy this, and let's go here, and now I need to change the okay, let's do this. Yeah, I think I need to completely take this off. Okay, I have it because I shouldn't close this thing, otherwise I will lose it. So let's make it very simple. Let's do this. I'll copy it up to here, and then go copy this paste it, and I'm doing this -k because otherwise the curl will want the client verification to happen. And you do this thing, now you immediately get a response. It doesn't even wait, right? And it just goes and uh, calls the backend, and you see. Okay, so I actually forgot to tell you what actually happens here and how do I go about telling the API manager, look, don't wait for it. And that's the important part, right? So I couldn't mention about that. So this is how you do that now. And if you don't do this thing, the API manager will wait for the backend response, right? So how to go about doing that is you go here in the policies section. I need to add a new policy like this. Give a name, description, version, or description, and you have to mention whether this policy is applicable for the request path or the response path or the fall path. So in my case, it will only be applicable for the request path. And supported API types, you can select HTTP, SOAP to REST and so forth, but typically HTTP only. And then you have to upload a file, and this file should be like this. So I'm having a file called fire and forget, and it has to have this extension called J2. And in that you need to add these three XML configurations. These are actually coming from Synapse because WSO2 API Manager's gateway is Synapse. And as of now, WSO2 is also working on some of the gateway types based on Go as well, but Synapse Gateway is what you find it in WSO2 API Manager 4.6.0, which is the latest as of today, right? So you need to add the property and say the out only value to true. So these properties are coming from Synapse, and it also says force status code accepted, and this is what says respond back with 202, right? So and I have added a log just to show that this particular policy is getting called, and that is what you are seeing here. As you can see, fire and forget true. And how you go about doing that is, now I have that policy already added, and for example, if you go here, you see fire and forget policy, you can view it and you can download it. As you can see, I have only applied for request and HTTP and so forth, and this policy is there. Now I need to apply that to my API, right? So I have gone into API or policies section. Under the policies section, you have to go to the API policies, or common policies actually. So it's under the common policies, and you have to drag and drop it here. I already have it, as you can see. If I hover it over, it says fire and forget policy. So that's why this policy is getting called, and it is done in the operation level. You can also add it in the API level. If you have multiple resources and you want this policy to get executed across all the resources, then you have to add it in the API level. I have only one resource anyway, so I have added it in the resource level, right? And that's why that is getting called. And so this step is very important. After you do this step, you have to do this deployment again and then publish it, right? And that's how things will work. So so that's how the fire and forget scenario works. You need to apply this particular the policy. This policy is not there out of the box, but this is the content. Make sure that you have a fire and forget.j2 file added. This extension should be just j2. Otherwise the policy, when you add the policy, it will throw an error saying that it doesn't know about the format and so forth. Okay, so one small thing, let's try this particular thing. I'm just gonna comment this out, and I'm gonna put this thing, I'm gonna call this particular process payload. I need to pass the payload and received at, right? So I'm now not calling it through an API. I'm just directly calling it so that this will wait. So let's do that. And now what I need to do here is I need to go and stop and restart this. And as you can see, it's restarted. And now if I just go and let's see, if I do this thing, you see I'm not getting the response, but it is hitting, right? And after 3 seconds, I'm getting the response. Now let's do that through the API Manager. I'm going to do that through API Manager. As you can see, the API Manager call immediately responded with HTTP status 202. It didn't even wait for it, right? And we can try that again. For example, I'm gonna make a call. It just came in. The request just received. Now only the 3 seconds went and it responded back with 202, but API Manager never waited for that. The client never waited for that. And that happened because of this policy that I just added. Hope this was useful for you to accomplish this async fire and forget policy in the API Manager, and I'll see you in another video very soon. Thank you very much for watching.